I'm pretty much ready to get going when you are, Seb. Are you ready?
Mhm.
So, folks, this is Seb Rose. Seb's co-founder with me at Cucumber Limited. He wrote the Cucumber for Java book, and latterly a book with Gaspar Nodge called Discovery. And that's really going to be the subject of Seb's talk today. And Seb does BDD training and coaching like all over the world. He's met, I would guess, getting into the hundreds of teams who are all sort of practicing BDD at different levels. So he's got loads of experience about how to do it wrong, how to do it right. And I'm hoping you're going to learn a lot from today. So as Seb is talking, please just fire questions into the Q&A channel, or if you want to chat, just chat away in the chat with each other. If you have questions, file them into the Q&A panel, and I will try and direct them to Seb as they seem appropriate during the talk, but he's not going to be looking at the Q&A. That's my job. Okay. So over to you, Seb. It's really weird how we can't hear them talking back, isn't it? Or look them in the eye.
But there you go. That's webinars for you.
That's webinars for
you. So thank you, Matt, and welcome everybody. I'm indeed going to be talking about discovery, the first practice of behavior-driven development. I guess what I'd like to do is I'd like to start by setting the scene. And although this is not just focusing on discovery, I really want to think about why is behavior-driven development even a thing? Because a lot of people ask that, they often come to us thinking that behavior-driven development is about test automation. So the first thing that has certainly energized parts of the community is realizing that Jira is not enough. User stories are not enough for us to communicate in an error-free way. So behavior-driven development is certainly an approach that tries to fill in the gaps that the agile methods that we use don't fill in, to try and make sure that we understand each other accurately, unambiguously. There's another problem that is quite common in the world, which is that documentation is often not very good quality. So what we find is that documentation is something that we do after the fact. It's something that it may have a cover sheet, which may have 8 or 10 signatures from important people on it, but unfortunately, that doesn't typically equate to high quality documentation. So a lot of the BDD approaches have a goal of creating documentation that we can rely on. And that becomes more and more important as we develop products that live for years and years, because you might be writing the product today and be perfectly capable of understanding the code and the system that you're designing and building, but often it goes off to maintenance teams that might be in other time zones, other parts of the world. And inevitably at some point in the future, if it's a successful product, someone's going to want to extend it or enhance it. And at that point, documentation and the accuracy of documentation becomes increasingly important. A lot of people believe that backlog grooming, which is a technique that, or one of the practices that Scrum teams often use, is a place where collaboration happens. I've been to lots of decomp, grooming, refinement sessions on teams, and overwhelmingly, my feeling about them is that they're not collaborative. They're a place when people get in a room together, often quite grudgingly, and frequently what happens is a story gets read out, potentially with its acceptance criteria, and someone says, "Is that clear?" To which the answer is universally, yeah, it's clear. And everyone walks out the door just as soon as they can. And as soon as they get back to their desks and start looking at the work they have to do, realize that there are many questions that remain unanswered. And finally, there's this idea that BDD and tools like Cucumber and Fitness are somehow going to allow test automation to be performed by people that don't understand the skills and techniques of software development. And what we see overwhelmingly is that the people that reach out to Cucumber Limited for training and consultancy and advice are often QA managers who are desperately trying to increase the level of test automation in their teams and in their companies. And although that's something that falls out of the BDD approach, it's not the reason that BDD exists. It's not the primary goal of BDD. And even if you do use tools like Cucumber and Fit or Fitness, we find that the people who actually write the automation code do require software development skills. So behavior-driven development addresses all of these. And what I'm going to try and do now is focus just on the first practice of BDD. So it's great that Matt is sharing this. Matt and Aslak wrote a book called The Cucumber Book quite a few years ago now. And in it, Matt tried to distill down a definition of BDD. And that definition is a good definition, but it still left people asking questions because some bits of it didn't communicate, certainly not to the whole population, exactly what BDD was. Dan North himself, who created BDD, has tried to come up with a definition as well. I'm not going to share that either. It's very opaque. So when Gashper and I sat down to try and write a book about BDD, which I'll talk about later, we tried to come up with a definition or a way of showing what BDD was in simple blocks, so that people could see that it wasn't just a thing; it was a set of practices that work together. The first practice, which is the focus of today's webinar, is called discovery. And the purpose of discovery is to create a shared understanding of the requirements through collaboration, typically achieved through a structured conversation centered on rules and examples. So some of these words themselves are not clear. We understand that the English language overloads words all the time. So I'm going to focus on rules and examples in a few minutes to try and make it clear how it is that we use them to create a shared understanding. The important thing that I want to stress here, and I'm going to stress it as we go through this webinar, is that BDD is a collaborative practice. So it's a set of practices rather where the different disciplines on a team work together to deliver quality software rather than working in isolation and passing artifacts such as documents between them. I'm going to cover very briefly, or just talk very briefly about the other two practices, just so that you've got the full scope of BDD. The second practice is formulation, which is where we take the examples that we discovered in discovery, and we formulate them in the business terminology. So this is a documentation activity. This is what gives us the persistent documentation that will be meaningful, not just to everyone that's working on the product today, but to all people that will work on the product in the future. And the final cherry on the cake, I guess it is, that we get from formulation and using some of the tools is that we can automate this documentation. So tools such as Fitness and Cucumber and SpecFlow can read the documentation that we formulated in the previous practice, and they can essentially run our documentation as an executable specification against the product that we're building. So this is the driven part of behavior-driven development. This is where we drive out the implementation. This automation, when combined with the documentation that we've created in the previous practice, creates living documentation. So documentation that tells us when it's out of date, tells us when a defect has crept in. And then finally, there's an arrow down the left-hand side of this diagram. And the reason for that is because we have come to understand that with BDD, it's important to start with discovery. The teams that we've worked with that have started with automation have invariably got themselves into a real mess, because what we're trying to do is understand the behavior that we expect the system to have, and then document that in a structured way so that it's easy to maintain that as the requirements for the product change. So the arrow is a really important part of this diagram. This is a complex, or no, the complex is the wrong word. This is a slightly busy diagram. So I'm taking this directly out of the discovery book. I'm not going to go into great details about it, but it does demonstrate a common workflow that we both see. Companies that have adopted BDD do well. And we've also spent a lot of time training companies to apply this to the way they currently work today. It actually fits in very naturally to a development team that works in in an agile process. Up at step number 1, which is in the top left, we're basically prioritizing a backlog. Then we go into a discovery phase where we're using these structured conversational techniques, which I'll talk about in a second, to make sure that we all understand the common requirements. Formulation then is where we turn this into living documentation. Automation is where we wire it up to the software that we're building. And then the number 6 step is your basic TDD. However, today I'm definitely going to focus on discovery. And so let's move on.
So Seb, just before we do move on, Richard Keast asked, what do you think about talking about rules and examples and then documenting the examples as scenarios?
So I'm not sure exactly on the question. So the answer is yes, that's exactly what we suggest you do. The rules specify the upper level, the abstract behavior of the system. So I will demonstrate this. There's an example coming up in just a minute. And then the examples themselves, the concrete examples, show how the system should behave given certain specific situations.
And that's what then turns into the scenarios when we do the formulation piece.
That's right. It's the examples that get formulated. The rules themselves form part of the documentation. Each example will illustrate a rule. In fact, each rule will typically have several examples that make that rule clearer and dispel any ambiguity.
Cool. I hope that answers your question, Richard. Please do ask another one if it didn't.
I'll move on. Synonyms. Oh, I've got the numbers in the wrong order. Anyway, this is synonyms number 1. Mm-hmm. There are some things that we find that in different parts of the community over the past few decades, we've used words loosely. I think this is probably true of computer science in general, and certainly business software development. So you will see, if you read through the literature, meetings that have been called the Three Amigos meeting. Equally, from the BA community, you will have had requirements workshops where you get together to try and get detailed analysis on the requirements. And we're also talking about discovery here as a place or an activity where we work collaboratively to try and uncover the requirements. And so essentially, we use these 3 terms interchangeably. Example mapping, which has been the topic of previous webinars, is our preferred technique for running discovery sessions. So example mapping is a simple technique, which was first documented by Matt, in fact, discovered by Matt. So you can ask him questions as well if you want as we go through. On this slide, there are links both to the blog post that he wrote in 2015 documenting the approach, and to a video that we recorded to try and make it, not interactive, but make it engaging. This picture that you see on the screen starts off with a yellow card at the top. So the idea about example mapping is that every story has a number of rules that define the scope of it. And each rule requires multiple examples to make the actual boundaries and behavior of the rule clear and unambiguous. And inevitably, when we start talking about a story, there will be questions that are currently unanswered and potentially currently unanswerable. And so that's where the 4 colors of cards come in. The process itself, as I said, is documented extensively, and I encourage you to follow those links and have a look at the material. However, this leads us to another set of synonyms. The rule word is not a rule that is commonly utilized in software development up until now. We frequently talk about business requirements, and we frequently talk about acceptance criteria. And different people mean different things when they use these terms. So essentially what I would like you to do for the time being is suspend any disbelief and treat rule, acceptance criteria, and business requirement as a set of synonyms. So I want to talk about just a simple rule. This is a training example that we use frequently, and I'm going to go through it quite quickly because we've got limited time, but we're basically talking about an ATM, a cash machine, which dispenses $10 bills and $20 bills for sake of argument. And the product owner has decided that the ATM should dispense a mix of these bills so that you don't end up with too many big bills and you don't end up with too many notes in your bills in your billfold. And one of the rules that has been identified is that an ATM should dispense at least one $10 bill, which is great. That's a fine rule. And actually it seems quite simple. So let's have a look at it. This was one of the examples that a developer came up with when they were trying to make sure that they understood how this rule was going to behave. And you'll see this is on a green card because it's an example, and it's split into 3 sections. On the left, it says ATM is full of cash. This part of the example is the context. This is the state of the world before the behavior that we're interested in has taken place. Then the middle section says $20 is requested. This is the action. This is what causes the system to exhibit the behavior that we're interested in. And the final section on the right is the outcome, which says that 2 $10 bills are dispensed. That's one great example. Does it tell you about everything that could possibly happen with this rule, a $10 bill that should be dispensed? Well, what happens if the ATM has no $10 bills, but the customer still requests a $20 bill? At this point, it enables the developers and or testers to really make sure that they've understood what the business are expecting of them. And in this situation, we reckon that maybe the machine should, rather than tell the customer to go away until $10 bills have been put into the machine, the customer should be given a $20 bill. It might not be ideal, but actually it satisfies the user on one level. The rules that will go into building an ATM will be many and complex, and you'll find that there are tens, if not hundreds of examples that you will need to make sure that those rules are communicated unambiguously. This was just a taster. The important thing here is that these examples that I showed you are concrete examples. They actually talk about real data points and talk about actual behaviors that the ATM should exhibit given certain foreseeable situations. The thing about discovery, so you saw it in the early process diagram, it comes right after deciding what next user story you are going to work on. But we need to somehow fit it into our ways of working. Most of you will be working, will have a software development methodology or process that your teams use already. And BDD isn't trying to supplement or isn't trying to supplant those ways of working. So Matt, could you run the second poll just now about which agile processes our listeners are currently utilizing?
Yes, I can. Poll number 2 coming up, Seb. Here it comes, viewers. I have launched a poll. What agile process do you follow? Scrum-like, Kanban-ish, scaled, some other agile process. We don't follow an agile process. Oh, look, there's quite a few, some others. We don't follow an agile process. What do you follow? Tell me in the chat. Nobody's doing safe, Seb.
That's surprising, isn't it?
So while we're waiting for the poll to come in, 2 people have asked sort of similar-ish questions, I think. Mariam, I guess that's how I say it, said, how do you, and he's using air quotes, discover if the product people are not clear on the requirements, but have an expectation on delivering something usable? So if you're having that conversation, how would you discover in that discovery conversation that there's too much fuzz and actually you don't have clarity to have rules and examples that you could go off and write scenarios and if statements for? Then the related question is, in some of our example mapping sessions, we generate lots of good conversations, but sometimes move too quickly to capture all the detail. Is it a good idea to use a facilitator to control the pace and the flow and make sure things get captured? So I feel like those are both questions about how to run a good example mapping session.
Well, so Thank you for passing those to me, Matt. You're obviously an expert in this as well. My take is that when you're running an example mapping session, if you are asking questions of your product people, and what you end up with is lots of blank faces, and you're writing question cards, you look at your example map, and if you have you don't have any rules, then you don't know what the scope of the story is. If you have lots of rules that have no examples, then you haven't ensured that you have a clear understanding of what you're requiring. And if you have lots of question cards, it's absolutely certain that you are not ready to proceed because there's too much doubt or uncertainty still in the story. So I do mention it later on in the session, but I believe that we can use example maps to strengthen our definition of ready. Until we have an example map that is well formed, that is, the story has some but not too many rules. Each rule has some concrete examples that illustrate it, and the story map has no unanswered questions on it. Until we can have that, we really don't know enough to get started.
Mm. And if I might add a bit to that, Seb, I mean, one of the ways I like to talk about an example mapping meeting or any kind of discovery workshop is it's kind of the same as like a filter, like you have a fuel filter on an engine, right? Which stops lumps from getting out of your gas tank and getting into the engine and clogging it up. And it's the same with big stories, that they get into the development team and kind of clog the development team up because they're complicated and people get lost in the uncertainty in them. And one of the advantages of example mapping is it can act like this filter because it slices the story up into small slices, so you can get the small pieces that will get through the filter. But if they're too big, if they're too uncertain, they can just kind of bounce back off the filter, right, and go back to the product people to figure it out in more detail before the team are like ready to accept it.
Can you remind me what the second question was, Matt?
Well, so it was about facilitating the session well. So sometimes the session seems to move too fast and we're not writing enough down.
So actually what I do there, and yeah, facilitator can always help, but it's whether you can find a suitable facilitator. I frequently try training teams by asking them not to speak when they're starting off in a discovery session, but until they've got the question captured on an example card. So essentially, the only thing you can do is you ask your product owner, your BA, you pass them the green example card and say, is this how it's supposed to behave? So at that point, you've already captured it. So you use your own scribing speed to control your mouth.
Yeah. And it can be a good idea to distribute the pens and the cards as well, so everybody's got one, so you can try and kind of have as fast a reflection back of what's being spoken about on the table as quickly as possible, because that's the idea, isn't it? It's kind of trying to keep what you're seeing in front of you in sync with what you're saying and thinking about. We've got the poll results in. Would you like them?
I think they're shared.
I think that you're right. And the winner is Scrum-like. Scrummish.
Excellent. So it's good that those two are the answers. Those are the two that I'm going to speak to just now. So in Scrum, what we recommend is that stories go through the discovery process before being pulled into a sprint. So this is where you enhance your definition of ready to say you would like to have a clean, clear, good looking example map before you pull a story off of the backlog and into the sprint. In the teams that we work with that are doing really well, the idea of backlog refinement or backlog grooming has pretty much been replaced by the discovery workshop, the discovery meeting. And this seems to work really well. What you'll see when you read Matt's blog post is that we think that discovery meetings should be short. Everybody likes a short meeting and happen often. And in fact, with teams that are new to discovery and example mapping, I typically suggest running a discovery workshop for 25 to 30 minutes every day. That might seem hard, but actually it seems to make work much better than having one every week that lasts 2 to 3 hours. And then finally, something was missing there. Once a story has been through a discovery process, especially using example mapping, the understanding of the level is down to a level of detail that's so clear that the actual sprint planning becomes fairly simple. So the fuel filter that Matt talked about earlier really helps you split that story down into something that is story sized, which I far prefer to trying to estimate the difference between a 5 story point story and a 13 story point story. And the goal that I have for teams that I work with is, rather than doing a large amount of estimation and then trying to add up numbers and stick them to velocity, you get to a point where you know approximately how many stories you can deliver in each sprint. And once they're past the definition ready, you just pull that many stories that are high priority onto the sprint backlog.
Because they're all ended at roughly the same size, Seb.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then Kanban, which was our other winner today, or coming in second. I've seen discovery being the first column on the Kanban board. So essentially, Kanban you pull when you have capacity in a particular phase. And so what would happen is, when you have no stories in discovery, you pull a story into discovery and you start working on it to ensure that your pipeline remains primed. Well, one of the things that teams find when they're working like this is that you need to take account for the fact that inevitably stories are going to have unanswered questions when they get pulled off the product backlog. And therefore you need to set your WIP limits in the discovery column accordingly to allow for some being blocked. So I just wanted to remind us where we were focusing on. So these were the 3 practices that I introduced at the beginning of the session. It's discovery that we've been focusing on today. We are thinking about creating shared understanding of the requirements, and we're going to do this collaboratively. Example mapping is our preferred way of running this structured conversation because it gives you a very lightweight and yet rigorous framework on which to hang the rules and the examples. And the expected outcome from that example mapping session is a set of rules and examples that work together to define the scope of that particular piece of functionality. So generally wrapping up, discovery is, gosh, this is working very slowly. It's a collaborative activity. Oftentimes teams that are new to BDD try and say, well, all of the scenarios will be written by our product owner, and all of the automation will be done by our testers, or some variety like that, creating new silos. We don't believe that BDD works like that. The idea of the 3 amigos and the discovery workshop is that the different roles collaborate to arrive at a shared understanding. Discovery is an iterative activity. So if you were, for instance, working in Scrum, as you find stories that are being prioritized on the product backlog, you would pass them through the discovery example mapping field filter. You don't do all of your stories through discovery right at the beginning and then build up a great big backlog of discovered stories, if such a phrase even makes sense. What we're talking about with discovery is, as necessary, doing the detailed analysis of the requirements. So that happens on a regularly iterative cadence throughout the product's life cycle. This one says it's during discovery that we start testing. One of the things that I think the software community has been hampered by for many years, if not decades, is the idea that testing is something that we do to software, or rather that we only do it to software. Testing can be done of understanding, and this is what the discovery session promotes and helps. It helps us test our understanding. If we're the delivery team, it helps us test our understanding of what the business would like us to do, and equally it helps test the business's understanding of what they're asking us to do. And then finally, discovery is process and tool agnostic. So although we have talked about example mapping a lot, and I've again talked about it today, you don't have to use example mapping to go through discovery. Discovery is about collaborating to ensure that we all understand the same thing, and that it's understood to a level of detail that is sufficient to enable the delivery team to deliver the functionality that's being requested.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize that. I mean, I was at a place just the other week, and we started out trying to use cards, and the domain just needed us to write a table of like data values, comparative data values on a whiteboard, because it was there was so much complexity there that we just needed to have like specific examples but written out in a table. So that's what we did. We used a whiteboard and just wrote the examples upon a table. So cards aren't necessarily always the right way to capture your examples and talk about them, and it's really important to not get boxed in by that and think that that's the only way to do it. Really, the key thing is to be using the examples to understand about the rules. And I think maybe that I think yeah. Sorry, Seb.
That's okay. So a one sentence, if it is even a sentence, a one sentence summary, which is discovery leads to a shared understanding of the detailed requirements. That's the goal of the discovery phase. None of the formulation or automation is worth doing until we have that shared understanding, because what you'd be documenting and automating is a potentially misunderstood requirement, and that's just going to cause pain and rework down the line. So in closing, there are my contact details. There's a picture of the cover of the discovery book. It's a refreshingly short book. You see by the thinness of the picture that I'm showing you here on the live screen. And it's been designed to be read by anybody on the team. So we have, we've trialed it with executives, UX specialists. I would have tried it on my granny, but she wasn't available. But I encourage you to try it on your granny. And that's here endeth my presentation.
Right, but you're not getting off stage that easily, Seb, because they've got questions.
Cool.
They've got questions. Do you want an easy one or a hard one to start with?
Why don't you give me the question? I'll tell you whether I think it's easy or hard.
All right. Well, so one of the early questions that came through, which I think is quite a good one, is you were talking pretty much right at the beginning about doing discovery instead of doing backlog refinement, or that like backlog refinement wasn't enough. And most people's experience of backlog refinement meeting is that the whole team is there. So one of the benefits of that meeting is, although they can be, really kind of drudgy, is that there's that shared consciousness that like everyone's been in a conversation. Whereas with these discovery workshops, we're talking about them being a sort of smaller, more focused group. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do we sort of like get that shared understanding across the team when we're doing it in this different way, where there's a smaller group involved in the deep discovery of an individual story? So
I think it makes for really good testing of your examples and your rules. So my goal is at the end of a discovery session, which will have been attended by, you're right, not the whole team, is that the example map that we have captured, whether it be on cards or in a whiteboard or however we decided was suitable for that particular role, that is sufficient to capture the conversation. And therefore it gives anybody else who wasn't in the room enough information to pick it up and work on it. So I don't believe that the people that attend the discovery session should be necessarily the people that implement the story. We should be capturing enough information to let anybody do it. Because remember, the ultimate goal is that in 5 years' time, when all of you have been promoted and moved to other organizations and a new team comes in and has to maintain this product, that documentation should still be sufficient for them to understand how the product was designed to behave.
Do you think, though, that there is going to be some knowledge that will inevitably only live in the heads of the people that were in that conversation, and that those people need to at least be sort of available to whoever does end up writing the if statements to maybe play proxy product owner if your product owner is not around? Or
well, so it's an interesting question. I think you use the word inevitably, and inevitably humans don't capture everything that they're hearing and imagining in their head on the bits of paper or the persistent documents that we want. But actually, to say let's ensure the whole team comes to these meetings because we're not capturing enough allows us to get lax and doesn't in any way gives us feedback about the quality of the examples that we're capturing. Whereas if you have a subset and then you pass the work on to somebody else and they notice something's missing, then you've got a piece of feedback that tells you that you didn't capture enough detail. And so I actually think there's some benefit to not having the whole team there, quite apart from the fact that having a whole team work through every story is an incredibly expensive procedure.
Right, it's a trade-off thing, isn't it? And the focus here is on doing the discovery and flushing out all the known unknowns, and you don't need the whole team for that. The focus is not on having the whole team understand everything about every story. The focus is on bouncing back the bad ideas that aren't fully enough understood yet. We just got asked by, it looks like Ryan Hislop, do you have any experience when dealing with user stories that have either an excessive amount of rules or rules that are perhaps a bit vague? So that's kind of related, really, isn't it? Like,
yeah. So I think both we have experience of both of those. So rules that are vague, they're flushed out by creating more examples. So essentially, as you try and understand what a rule means, you're going to come up with concrete examples that probe the edges of it, that probe the meat of it. And frequently what happens in those situations is that you discover that either the rule needs to be reworded or refined, or most possibly it's several rules masquerading as one. So you see those blue cards proliferate. And the other one was about rules, having too many rules. Yeah, and that's one of the ways that we use to decide that a story is too big and decide to split it into multiple stories. So there's a longer answer to this, which is a rant that I do on a regular basis about user stories, which is that we get very, very het up about the structure of a user story and the as I want so that template. Whereas the truth of a user story is that it's a planning tool to allow us to schedule the delivery of thin increments of product functionality. If you find yourself with a story that has 15 or 20 rules that scope it, then it's way big. And what I would suggest is you split it into 5 or more stories, and you essentially group rules that seem to be connected under the different 5 stories that smaller stories that you're creating. And then you decide which ones are the highest priority and schedule those stories early. You may not be able to release the product to the customer until you've delivered all of these 5 smaller stories, but you will have 5 small stories and they will be implementable independently. And that will then give you, that will de-risk the whole iterative process, allowing you to deliver thinner slices.
So cool. So what about like a cadence for how frequently you do this and sort of how far in advance of the development work that you would do this? So James is asking how much early example mapping would be appropriate in order to estimate a fixed price delivery, which is obviously quite a kind of an extreme example of how far ahead you might be trying to do this. What do you think is the sweet spot for like when's the right time and how often?
You're not going to get a good answer from me. So, or rather you won't get an answer here that you like, because fixed price means that you have to price in the risk, right? There's no way that ahead of time how long something's actually going to take, which is why we call it an estimate. Estimates have, some people really like them. Some people say you shouldn't be using them. There's a wonderful open letter to the community written by Alan Kelly. We should post, Theo, remind us to post this link on the post afterwards. And it's called Dear Customer. And the opening lines of this open letter says, "Dear customer, I'm afraid the truth is we don't know how long it's going to take or how much it's going to cost." So example mapping will help you do this, but the reality is that even when people used to go into a huge amount of detail to specify what the product should do, what they found was that people changed their minds as things went, as the project proceeded, and some of the problems that they didn't anticipate changed the dynamic and the delivery of the product in ways that could not have been imagined until you started doing the work. So the answer about cadence is simpler, which is I think we should do example mapping on a regular basis, several times a week, if not daily. And you should do it at least in the iteration before you intend to work on a story. If you're trying to do a fixed price quote for a customer for a large product, then you have to decide whether you are going to take on the risk, whether they're going to take on the risk, or whether you're going to find a way of working where the risk is shared. But But either way, you won't be able to guess the price at the beginning with any degree of accuracy unless you're just redoing something that you've already done 100 times before.
Yeah.
In which case,
Why do you need to do discovery? But I think the other thing I was thinking about that is example mapping is a very detailed level to get down to for doing an estimate for a fixed price job. So I would only want to be investing effort in example mapping discovery work for a story that I was basically committed to building something of it, because it's quite a lot of effort. I mean, we talk about doing 25 minutes worth of work for a single story, 25 minutes worth of work for maybe, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 days worth of development work, but it's still quite an investment of time and energy. And then you need to go off and document that with scenarios and so on, and feedback and check them. So you're doing work that really you only want to be investing that much rigor and time in if you're committed to needing to build the thing. And it's more magnifying glass, more level of detail than I would want to go down to for bidding on a piece of fixed price work, I think. Like Seb says, just take your finger in the air estimate and then triple it.
I didn't say that.
Well, you said building the risk, didn't you?
Yeah, I said someone's going to have to take the risk because there's lots of research around this. If you look at the art of software estimation, there's the cone of uncertainty. Before you start work, empirical evidence, which you may or may not believe in this empirical evidence, but it demonstrates that typically a software developer's or team's estimate is typically off by up to a factor of 4.
Okay. Seb, I think we've got one last question that we could just finish on to wrap up. What about when your client doesn't want to use these kind of techniques? How do you go about kind of convincing them or working with a client? So if you're on the development side and you think this is a good way to engage with them, what are some ways to bring them on board?
In all situations, whenever you're trying to convince somebody else that what you want to do is a good idea, it's worth framing it as a short-term experiment. You show them the dysfunction that you're trying to deal with. You say, I'm not sure if this will work, but can we try it? And you then set it for a 2-week experiment or 2 iteration experiment and see how that plays out. If they still don't want to run an experiment, if they're not amenable to talking to you, you can try and work out what it is that's holding them back. With product owners and business analysts, it's often that they are too busy and they don't think that there's value in them engaging with you. At that point, metrics and numbers are always a good tool to try and utilize. So I would try and capture metrics on rework. I would ask them to capture information about how many questions they get asked after they thought that everybody understood what I was doing. Capture metrics on how many issues were discovered during a sprint review. And in all these ways, you can begin to build a picture of the waste and the rework that the system currently is producing and try and use that to encourage them to try a different tack. At some point, you'll either find a solution that works for them or they'll be prepared to try your solution because it's causing them pain and it's causing a negative effect on the bottom line of the business.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that one of the reasons that we came up with this technique of example mapping was because we know that those people are busy, their time is precious, and actually trying to get them drawn into the level of detail that it takes to write Gherkin documents in the formulation bit and trying to do the discovery and formulation all at the same time is really boring for people at that level. So actually trying to just have a quick conversation where you're able to pull out the most important bits of information out of them as quickly as possible and let them get back to doing what they do is another good way to kind of keep them on board with it, because you're not forcing them to spend a load of time on stuff that feels laborious and doesn't feel like they're getting the best use of their time. Seb, I'm going to have to stop us there. So thanks ever so much, Seb Rose, everyone. There's 4 questions left in the queue. I'm really sorry we didn't get time to answer them. I'll try and answer them by text as we finish. We've got, I've just put a message in the chat with a link to our Twitter, so you can ask us questions on the Twitter. That's also the Seb Rose on the Twitter as well. Theo, can you put his link to that in the Slack, or me? And you can also come and join us in the community Slack as well. So if you follow that link, we all hang out in there. So do loads of other people from the Cucumber community. So lots of good chat going on in there for you to follow up and ask more questions and have more conversation. Thanks everyone for showing up. Hope this has been useful. See you next time.
And this gets posted onto YouTube.
Yes. So you can tell all your friends to watch it then.
There you go. Great.
Bye. Bye everyone.